A play of questionable morality crossed Giuseppe Verdi's desk in 1849. The play was Victor Hugo's Le Roi s'amuse, about a French king and his insatiable lust for women. The play ultimately was about absolute power and the corruption that often attends that. This is something that was very attractive to Verdi. But when the state censors found out that this was the subject of Verdi's latest opera, they got very, very nervous. It took a lot of negotiation, but finally the opera made it to the boards in 1851. It's about power, corruption, sex and murder, scandal and revenge. It's all the themes that are ripe for Hollywood today, despite the fact that it's 150 years old. Welcome to the world of Rigoletto. I'm Nick Reveles. This is OperaTalk. No. Tom Cruise is just not right for it. Absolutely. Look, let's talk about it tomorrow. Let's do lunch. Spagos? Perfect. Let's say around 2-ish. Love your work. Mean it. Bye. Rigoletto. It's one of those operas with such a strong plot, with such a strange plot that it's almost like something out of film noir. I mean, it could easily be right out of Hollywood. The story has universal themes. It's about the destruction of lives through absolute power. And because of such a strong theme, it can be adapted to more contemporary settings. In fact, there's one very famous production out of ENO in London, in which the entire story is placed in Little Italy in New York in the 1950s, and it has a kind of a mafioso background. There's also a Hollywood production of Rigoletto, where the Duke of Mantua, the womanizer, is a movie mogul, and Rigoletto, the court jester, is his Hollywood agent. Well, the writing, as I said, both musically and textually, is so strong, it can handle non-traditional productions. In fact, those non-traditional productions can actually illuminate its very strong themes. So what exactly was it that attracted Giuseppe Verdi to this story? Well, certainly it was the power of the original play, which is the source of Rigoletto. The play was Le Roi s'amuse by Victor Hugo. The translation of the French is simply The King's Amusement. The story was about Francis I, a 15th century monarch of France. You may remember him as the monarch who was the patron of Leonardo da Vinci in his last years. Now, in France in the mid-19th century, when the play was written, Francis I was somewhat revered. But Victor Hugo wanted to explore Francis's wicked side and the power inherent to royal corruption in the court, and how that could affect people's lives. So there was lots of womanizing on this side of Francis's evil character. And there was the court jester, Triboulet, who eventually becomes Rigoletto, who had a beautiful daughter, and the daughter becomes the focus of Francis I's lust. What Victor Hugo was trying to discuss, trying to unfold, was the place of the absolute monarchy in the modern world. And in fact, it was so incendiary, there was only one performance in 1832 of the play, because the censors banned it. A scant 20 years later, the plot of this play seemed perfect to Giuseppe Verdi, the composer, for turning into an opera. The character of Triboulet, the hunchback jester, and the whole plot seemed absolutely perfect. He thought it was one of the best subjects ever to turn into an opera. Now, understand Verdi's predicament at this time. He was under contract to the Teatro La Fenice, one of the greatest opera houses in Europe and located in Venice. He thought Venice would be a perfect place for the premiere of this opera, the working title of which was La Maledizione, the Curse. It didn't become Rigoletto until a few months prior to the premiere. And he chose as his librettist someone with whom he had worked a number of times up to this point, and he happened to be the resident poet of the La Fenice. This was Francesco Maria Piave, and he was called upon by Verdi to write the libretto. Verdi was always suspicious of the censors, the Italian opera police, if you were. And there were two sets of censors. There were censors who were church censors or ecclesiastical censors, because the church, of course, at that time was very powerful. There were also state censors. Verdi asked Piave, his librettist, to make sure that the story of Le Roi Amuse would be acceptable to the censors in Venice. Piave reassured Verdi time and again that there would be no problem with this, and so they began writing the opera. After the cast was chosen, they were all assembled and ready to rehearse. The Venetian censors, citing Rigoletto's, and I quote, disgusting immorality and obscene triviality, banned the show entirely. Poor Piave. He was the brunt of all of Verdi's wrath in an exchange of angry letters over a couple of months, mostly from the composer to the librettist. Piave realized in order to save this opera after the banishment of the opera by the censors, he needed to call a summit meeting. So he and the publisher Ricordi, the director of the La Fenice, they all met at Verdi's estate in Busseto, on the outskirts of Milan. Verdi finally agreed to some changes. The setting had to be moved from the court of France to a minor principality, either in Italy or in France. They finally agreed on Mantua. Verdi was insistent that the prince, or the duke in this case, would still hold absolute power over the other characters. Secondly, all of Victor Hugo's characters would have to be retained. This was Verdi's demand. But the censors demand that all of the characters' names be changed. Hence, the King of France becomes the Duke of Mantua, and Triboulet, the court jester, becomes Rigoletto. Finally, the scene at the end of the opera where Rigoletto discovers his dying daughter in a body bag, in a sack. He won this particular tussle with the censors, and they agreed to allow the scene, with as many changes as Verdi would demand. The premiere, of course, was put back a couple of months to mid-March 1851. Now, these compromises seemed to satisfy the censors, and rehearsals began in February. In the cast was the great baritone Felice Varese. He was Verdi's first Macbeth some years before, and he was cast in the role of Rigoletto. Now, despite the rather salacious tone of the opera and constant problems with censors throughout Europe, Rigoletto was an immediate success with the public. In fact, within a decade, it had 250 performances. Excuse me a moment. Talk to me. Yeah. No. She's all wrong. All wrong. Yeah, maybe somebody else. We'll see.
Camera.
Speed. Slate.
OperaTalk, scene 3A, take 9, mark. Action.
The plot of Rigoletto is rather like the plot of a Hollywood suspense film, and yet the opera very closely follows the original Victor Hugo play, opening as it does in the court of the Duke of Mantua. The Duke is a proud and lascivious man who has only recently seduced the daughter of one of his courtiers, Monterone. Rigoletto, the court jester, mocks the grief of the stricken father, and the old man turns on the Duke and the court jester, Rigoletto, and curses them. Now, disguised as a poor student, the Duke begins wooing Gilda, who is the daughter of Rigoletto. Rigoletto has been successful in hiding her from view, not only from the court, but from the libertine Duke. But the courtiers have experienced the sharp wit and the biting tongue of Rigoletto, and so they conspire to kidnap his daughter. They take her to the court and present her to the Duke as a gift. There, the Duke rapes Gilda, and Rigoletto, naturally, as a loving father, is brought to despair. He seeks out an assassin, Sparafucile by name, to kill the Duke. Sparafucile has a sister named Maddalena, and she, like just about every other woman in Mantua, has fallen in love with the nobleman, and she asks Sparafucile to spare his life. She says instead, why don't we simply kill the next person who comes to our inn before the stroke of midnight, and present that person as the victim to Rigoletto. Gilda, of course, tragically overhears all of this and decides to sacrifice herself for her seducer. She presents herself as the next person at the inn at the stroke of midnight and is murdered by Sparafucile. He gives the body bag, the sack, to her father, who thinks he's in the possession of the Duke. He's horrified to learn when he opens the bag that it is instead the body of Gilda. He remembers the curse of Monterone, the wronged father from Act 1, and singing La Maledizione, the curse, he falls, collapses over the body of his beloved daughter. As I said earlier, Rigoletto is one of those operas that's unique in the sense that it's able to be adapted to more contemporary times and settings. I'd like to explore that with our opera mogul, Ian Campbell, General Director of San Diego Opera and a stage director of a number of operas. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Nick.
What exactly is it, Ian, about this opera that makes it possible to approach it in a non-traditional way?
I think when you look at the storyline itself is very contemporary. Although in Verdi's time it was all about a curse, it's really about sexual predators, it's about power, it's about dominance. And if you simply rewrote the story today, forgot that Rigoletto had ever existed, you could set it in the White House, you could set it in Congress, Gilda could be a missing intern, it could be anything. Because what it is about is power. And by moving it as we've done to Hollywood and the moguls of today, we see that power far more clearly. Because when you have it set comfortably in an old French or Italian court, which is what the censors required Verdi do when he wrote it, it becomes so far removed from today we just sit back and look at cute costumes and we don't think about the story.
Right. And you can't do this with just any opera. I mean, I can't imagine taking Verdi's Aida, for instance, and updating it to, let's say, 1960s Las Vegas or something like that.
No, I don't think you can. You've got to look very seriously at the story. What we should remember, though, is that opera is always adapting. It's always changing. There are people who think that opera should never change. They say it must be done the way the composer intended. Well, it is done the way the composer intended musically, but we must remember that opera is a merge of art forms, and therefore scenic design is always different. Settings are very rarely where they were set originally. A good example is Verdi's A Masked Ball, which is set in Boston, or sometimes it's in Sweden. It was meant to be Sweden, but the censors made him move it to Boston.
Yeah, Verdi had a lot of problems with censors.
A lot of problems, you see,
Right.
And therefore we have to respect the fact that he was really pushing the borders himself. He was expanding the horizons of opera. His own La Traviata he wanted performed in modern dress. And I believe that he would have wanted that dress to be continually updated. But when it premiered, it had to be put back into dress of the 1700s, because the censors of the day again said you can't talk about today's subjects. Now what we do with this version of Rigoletto is we respect the music and the story, But because it's set in Hollywood with its power struggles, we suddenly go, my God, this story is relevant. It's not just cute music. But something like Aida in Las Vegas, no, that doesn't make sense. Whereas Così fan tutte on the beach at the Hotel del Coronado made a lot of sense and was a huge success and very popular with the public. But again, the integrity of the story was protected, and that's what matters. But even the term updating is a dangerous one, I suppose, because what we should really think about is re-examining. If we look at our Shakespeare, nobody does Shakespeare today, except perhaps at the newly built Globe in London, the way Shakespeare did it. You don't see Shakespeare done the way Shakespeare did it at the old Globe here in San Diego. If we did, there'd be no women on the stage, because he didn't use women. There are so many things that have changed where we will re-examine the text and the meaning, but the world of opera is a lot more conservative. We tend not to do that, and I think what we need to do is every now and then have a look at something like Rigoletto a little differently and go, yeah, the story is relevant, it could happen today, people do behave this way, and this one with sexual predators, power, dominance, it's straight out of today's headlines.
Ian, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
As usual with Verdi, he gets right to the dramatic point as quickly as possible. At the beginning of the opera, the scene opens in the court of the Duke of Mantua. We need to know as an audience that this is a morally bankrupt place, that the people are superficial and corrupt. And so he needs to give us music that will help us know that quickly and efficiently. So Verdi scores party music to be played by a backstage banda or band, and it's just as superficial and corrupt as the people in the party. Here it is. Well, you get the idea. And playfully, interestingly, the composer sets the first little bits of dialogue in the opera over this party music. Now, part of this decadent quality of music is used to characterize the Duke himself. His music is dance-like, the tunes are bold, they're obvious, they're aggressive, they're actually just like him. This, for instance, is the opening aria for the Duke of Mantua, Questa Quella. It's like a jig or a siciliano. Of course, one of the most well-known tunes in the opera, La Donna è mobile, is attached to the Duke himself. It's in the last act, and this too is just as bold, just as aggressive as all the rest of his music. This is music of a very obvious nature with very little subtlety or nuance required. It's also music that's very highly structured, very conservative in a sense, reflecting the character of an absolutist court. How different then is the music for the character of Rigoletto himself? Now, here is an outwardly ugly character. He's a hunchback whose disability has forced him into a court position that encourages his bitter and caustic nature. Inside, however, he's a loving and protective father. When we first meet him, he almost blends into the musical woodwork, simply singing his dialogue over that dance music that we heard earlier. But the party comes to a feverish pitch, and Monterone, the father, enters angrily. He's then intercepted by Rigoletto, who mimics the voice and the manner of the wronged father. Listen to the music that accompanies this moment, because it perfectly characterizes both Rigoletto's mimicry as well as his deformed body as he lurches across the room. After Rigoletto's first encounter with Sparafucile in an alley outside his home, he reflects on the events of the evening. He says in the libretto, "This murderer and I, we're alike. I with my tongue, he with a dagger. I mock, he slays." And then we get this wonderfully descriptive music. Then he says, "O men, O nature, you have made a villain of me. O fury, to be misshapen, to be a jester." All of these twisted little musical figures came from the idea I played earlier when Rigoletto was mocking Monterone. But towards the end of this recitative, he expresses himself somewhat differently, reflecting on his beautiful daughter Gilda, and that when he's at home, he's happy when he's joined with her. But in my home, I am another. All of this creates this wonderfully dual character of Rigoletto, the music perfectly describing his two natures, the ruthless outer core and his tender interior. In fact, the whole role, which lies murderously high for baritones, has no real aria, just these wonderful monologues and ensembles that makes him one of the most unusual characters in all opera. We have a wonderful array of recordings of Rigoletto for you to go out and buy or to listen to in order to become more familiar with the work. This season also I'm going to suggest books that you can read, that you can take out of the library or order online to, again, make you more familiar with this style of Giuseppe Verdi. Let's talk about the recordings first. Probably the most important recording of Rigoletto in the last half-century is the recording with Maria Callas as Gilda, with Tito Gobbi as Rigoletto, and Giuseppe Di Stefano as the Duke. Although the recording is old and the sound isn't terribly good, the performances are white hot. Wonderful, wonderful recording. There's a more recent recording with Renato Bruzon as Rigoletto, Neil Shikoff as the Duke of Mantua, and Edita Gruberova as Gilda. This is conducted by Giuseppe Sonopoli, and it's on the Philips label. Now, there's a very inexpensive way to go with some opera recordings, but you've got to remember that this series, called Opera d'Oro, does not include libretti. This particular performance is live from 1966, a very young and vital Luciano Pavarotti in what was probably his signature role, Renata Scotto as Gilda, and the wonderful baritone Costas Pascalis as Rigoletto himself. Finally, many people feel that this particular recording conducted by Richard Bonning is their all-time favorite, with Joan Sutherland as Gilda, with Luciano Pavarotti again in the role of the Duke of Mantua, and Cheryl Milnes, the great American baritone, as Rigoletto. This, of course, is in stunning stereo, dates somewhere from the mid-70s, and is really a terrific recording. Now, in terms of books, you can't get any better than Julian Budden's monumental 3-volume work, The Operas of Verdi. This is, admittedly, a technical work, but it also is chock full of information, background, history about all of the operas, and about opera in Italy during the 3 major periods of Giuseppe Verdi's life. If you want something a little bit more condensed, The Complete Operas of Verdi by Charles Osborne is the book for you. I'm sure out of all of this material, you'll find something that will be very helpful in getting you into the opera house and being familiar with Rigoletto and the operas of Verdi. Rigoletto is the opera that marks the beginning of Verdi's middle period. This is a very fruitful period that includes some of Verdi's greatest works: La Traviata, Il Trovatore, Un ballo in maschera, Simon Boccanegra, and La Forza del Destino. It was also the opera that marked a new spirit in Italian opera, particularly in Verdi's works. I mean, Verdi had gotten quite bored with the tried and true structures of opera and wanted to revitalize it, bring new dramatic realism and dynamism to this art form. Well, in Rigoletto, he did just that, and with a character that fascinated him more than any other. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.
È sempre misero chi a lei s'affida, a chi le confida, mal cauto il cuore, pur mai non sente sì, felice appieno, chi in su quel seno non gli va amore. La donna è mobile, la più vale vento, muta da cielo. Pensier